Welcome everybody to the training on human resources and very specifically a guide to the human resources guidebook and how to use it, which is part of the Social Enterprise Policy Bank. So what we're going to cover in this training today, we're going to look at what the HR policy template is and how you go about adapting it to your organization. We're going to take some time together to get a bird's eye view of employment law and human resource management. So when we say those terms, like what is the terrain we're talking about, we're really going to try and look at overall what are we discussing, so you'll have a sense of what all that means when you're looking at your policy guidebook. And the last thing we're going to do is that we're going to look at some of the key risks that arise in human resource management and some of the opportunities you have to potentially prevent those risks arising. And that last bit's fun. We're going to look at some case law and try and figure out why certain decisions were made and whether people were successful in court and why. And you'll learn a little bit about how the whole system works. Okay. So employment law and HR, a bird's eye view. First thing we're going to do is we're going to just map the terrain together. Okay. So we're going to go into breakout groups. And I'm going to give one question to each group. And the first question is, where is it written or where are the rules for how we manage a person's employment? What do I mean by that? You've heard me talking about employment law. We're talking about policy. Where are all these things written? Where else does it come from? The rules about how you manage a person's employment. The second question is, the second group will be answering, what are like the key processes or the key activities that are involved in the management of an employee's journey through the organization? Hint, from recruitment all the way to the other end. What are all the key processes an organization might have where the person's employment is managed and where they're supported in their performance? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes in a breakout room. Okay, and let me tell you who's in what room. So we have one room that has Danielle, Fiona, Martina, and Patrick. Let me just see, Danielle, Fiona, Martina, and Patrick. And then we have another room that is Mary Mullen, Orla, and Diane. Okay, so room one is Danielle, Fiona, Martina, and Patrick. Why don't you guys take question one? Is that okay? So where is it written or where are the rules for how we manage a person's employment? Don't worry, you don't have to have the answers. Like a lot of this is just to get the cogs turning and just try and map this a little bit. So is that question clear enough for you guys? Don't worry, I'm not asking if the answer is clear, just the question. Does it make sense? Yeah, great. And then room two, document an employee's relationship through an organization by listing the processes or activities that guide it. Diane, Mary, and Orla, does that question make sense?
Is this within each of our own organizations?
Any organization, exactly. Wherever you know it. Yeah, exactly. It can be your organization, and then the other organization will say, well, we do this. Is that part of that? And et cetera, et cetera. And that's how you get your answers. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. Lovely. Okay, so let's just look at some of what we've got for that. For those two questions. So thank you for your answers. The sources of the rules relating to employment, there are many, even as far up as the Constitution, because the Constitution has rules in relation to the right to organize, and it also delineates the role of various courts, which is relevant in many cases to employment law when things go wrong. It also kind of details the role of the Oireachtas in passing laws and things like that. So it goes as far as the Constitution. We also have things called EU directives. So these are things that various bodies in Europe will say that European Union members need to do. And then in countries, each country will then transpose these directives to become law. Does that make sense? So they say, you need to sort out this, this, and this. And then the countries will then translate them into law in whatever legal system that we have. And they tend to be quite broad. And then we transpose or translate them into our law. We then have employment law. So that's all the rights and entitlements of employees and the obligations of employers in relation to that. And that kind of employment law covers everything from kind of how contracts are issued, what should be in contracts, things around, or there's organization of working times, so how many hours people should be working, how often. There's a lot of law around termination of employment. There's a lot of law in relation to employment equality. It's a very broad spectrum. And as I mentioned earlier, the things, a summary of employment laws is really huge. There's a lot in there, but thankfully there are some useful resources out there. If you're really interested in kind of knowing what's happening, the Workplace Relations Commission regularly kind of post updates on kind of recent changes to employment law. You can look at summary of changes to employment law in the last 6 months or whatever. So definitely worth checking out there. They have lots of really useful resources. IBEC tend to have the IBEC, the business organization, tend to have some quite useful resources on their website too. And then Peninsula Ireland, who are a consulting company, they tend to have a blog that often updates on important, like during the pandemic, they would have written a lot about kind of working from home. They tend to be very current and helpful then. And of course, places like the Wheel and the Carmichael Centre often have bulletins and trainings that kind of give you updates on developments in employment law. That's worth following. So you never have to navigate this territory on your own. It's too much for any of us as little organizations to do. The next source is things like codes of practice. Have you heard of codes of practice? So these are directives that would be issued that document how we should deal with certain things. They're not law, but if you don't follow them, you'll lose if a court case was taken against you. So there's like codes of practice on grievance, disciplinary, harassment and sexual harassment, whether someone's a contractor or an employee. There's lots of different codes of practice that are relevant to us. And then, as you guys said, policies and procedures. The organization's policies and procedures, just as Ireland transposes EU directives into law, organizations then transpose the employment law and codes of practice into how we do what we do. So our policies around this should describe how we meet and fulfill our obligations to our employees, and how we communicate them to our employees, how we record them. That's really what our policies and procedures should delineate, is how we are working in line with the law and ensuring their rights are realized. The policies and procedures we've put together are far more extensive than what's in employment law. They go into performance management. So performance management is less regulated by law. There's less clarity on what you should and shouldn't do. So when we say performance management, we mean things like supervision, appraisal, everything that's outside of those formal legal processes. So you'll have policies and procedures on them. Regardless, any of your processes around supervision, appraisal, or anything like that still need to be connected into those more formal legal processes. So for example, if you're doing supervision, it's not going well, and you do performance improvement plans, and there's a possibility it could result in disciplinary, then that has to be named in your policies and procedures, and you have to let your staff know that. So anything that might result in kind of moving into those more legal areas around disciplinary and things like that, it must be noted. The one thing about your policies and procedures as well is if you have them, and you end up in court or anything like that, the question will be asked is, did you follow them? Like, the policies and procedures have to be a true and accurate kind of representation of what happens in your organization. So worth knowing that it's not a great idea to just grab a template off the shelf and say, yeah, sure, this will do, without actually giving it the attention it deserves to make it real to your organization. The next one, custom and practice. This one is kind of, I think this is a bit fascinating. We worked with an organization where it was written into staff contracts. So contracts obviously go in there as well, guys. Contracts are really a summary of kind of, again, the terms and conditions, many of which relate to employment law. But we were working with an organization who had contracts in for the staff that said, you work from 9 to 5. But over a number of years, it had become normal for people to come in at 9:30. The manager of service changed, a new CEO came in, and she could see, it was around employment, and she could see that some of the service users were finished dropping off their kids and actually needed somewhere to go for 9 o'clock, and were ready to work at 9 o'clock. So she said, okay, we're going to open at 9 instead of 9:30. Seems reasonable, doesn't it? Like it's in their contracts, their clients need it. However, when the staff didn't agree and they ended up having to get mediation and they ended up progressing up to the WRC, I think it was, and they were told, she was told that custom and practice was actually quite a strong argument for her not being able to do what she did. So she didn't get away with it. Because like, if you think about this from a reasonable perspective, like all of these employees had come to believe and understand that what was required of them was beginning their workday at 9:30. They'd organized their lives around this, childcare, you know, all of their transport, all that stuff had been organized around it. So for her to come in and just direct everyone to change was felt it was unfair. Did that mean she couldn't work to change it? No, of course it didn't. She had failed to negotiate. She'd failed to consult. So a failure to negotiate and consult will really usually be looked on, you know, quite sternly. So if she had consulted and said, we're going to give it 3 months and we're going to work backwards to X, Y, and Z, and you can take an extra 15 minutes on your lunch break, or, you know, she could have looked at to consult and negotiate with the staff on this to make sure it suited everyone and that the change was reasonable and fair to them. But her failure to do that meant that she lost on custom and practice. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. And then other documents that might influence your conditions around employment and things like that might be if you have service level agreements with funders. So obviously anyone with 2 staff, with CE staff, you have specific requirements in relation to those staff that your funders have required. Some people might be working in line with quality standards. HICWA quality standards, for example, have specific requirements or guidance in relation to staff support and supervision. So obviously you'd be trying to work in line with your quality standards and things like that. Does that make sense, folks? Any questions on that bit? You can pop them in the chat or say them into the room. Great. Lovely. The second question was in relation to what are all the various processes around this that organizations might have in place. So before, it's interesting, legally, your employment relationship begins before you've ever even met a person. You have obligations in relation to your hiring, your advertising, and your processes around selecting people for interview. So this is called advertising and recruitment. So you have to very much employment equality is very important at this particular stage of a process. And then around selection. Okay. So advertising is, you know, where you're advertised. Recruitment is kind of selecting who you're going to interview, and then selection is who you choose, you know, from your interview panel, if that's the route you choose to go. At the beginning down here, don't know why this isn't in linear order, but sure, it'll keep us on our toes. At the beginning, this is the stuff you mentioned, guys. So you have things like the contract and terms and conditions. You have processes often around induction, initial training. You might have a probation period, and then during their employment, kind of when they're all settled in, and there you might have things like supervision or performance review or performance improvement processes. And then you, so performance improvement, if you're not familiar with that term, usually relates to when someone's not performing optimally and you can see that something needs to be done to kind of say, look, we need to acknowledge that this isn't moving at the pace we'd like it to move. Let's figure out what that is. Let's put support in place for you. Let's create clear expectations for you to meet, but it's not formal disciplinary. It's pre-disciplinary. Okay, so that's what performance improvement plans, some people call them PIPs. You might have heard of them if you don't have them yourself. And then any training and development that might be available for the person. And then, of course, we have the end of employment. Of course, employment can end in a number of different ways. Employment can end because the person leaves, because you ask them to leave, and you could ask them to leave for a multitude of reasons. It might be a termination of their employment for issues around performance or conduct. It might be a redundancy because the position is no longer there or the business isn't viable. It might be a retirement. And then, of course, employees, there might be an employee death. And all of these things will be covered in any policy in relation to HR. How does that sound? Have I missed anything that anyone can think of? All good. Any questions on that so far? No. Great. Lovely stuff. Your HR policy template. So for those who didn't know, I mentioned earlier, a HR policy template has been circulated to organizations in case they need it. And the fundamental purpose of this training is to kind of familiarize you with that. So through that conversation we've just had, you have a bit of a sense of where all the rules have come from that we have put into this transposed, that's our word for this evening, transposed into this kind of policy guidebook that you guys may choose to use. We've also mapped the terrain of kind of HR and employment law, so you'll get a sense of the different sections of the policy that we're going to be looking at. The policy itself, you'll see, there's about 54 pages, so we're not going to go through it in great detail today. There's about 6 sections. There's one appendix. What you'll see when you get in there is that there's 2 font colors. The red font has to be changed. The black font needs to be reviewed and can be approved, might not need to be changed. I'll show you. You'll get that more tangibly when we look at it together. So we're going to go through an overview of the document and kind of what it contains. So just FYI, you'll be familiar with some of these terms already prior to now, if not from during this training. But there's sections on induction, so how employees are supported in the first months in the probation period. We look at leave, so kind of statutory leave and then any optional or additional leave your organization might provide. There's a section on systems around performance management. Specifically, we use supervision and appraisal are the terms we use there. If you're not familiar with that kind of, with that terminology, and people can have different language around this stuff, but supervision would refer to kind of regular meetings between an employee and their line manager to kind of set work goals, review them, provide feedback, give the person an opportunity to debrief, share any concerns they're having or difficulties they're having in work. And appraisal is usually something that's done annually around kind of, measuring performance and rating performance and looking at plans to improve performance, supporting planning around annual work planning for the staff member too. The stuff around training, the stuff around disciplinary and grievance. There's a section on working from home. There's a section on leaving the country. And then we've put in, although it's very different, the legal requirements for volunteering compared to employment law are very, very different. And we'd say be very cautious. Don't treat your volunteers like employees because you certainly don't have the same legal obligations to them. Although, of course, you have moral obligations, I suppose, to make sure they feel valued and they're getting to contribute, and there's clear expectations and there's processes for them to raise concerns with you. So all of that is covered in the volunteering section with the strong caveat that it's not employment law. We've just included it in here for you because maybe some of the processes, particularly around the non-legal end of things, can be very similar if you want to run a good volunteering program in your organization. So let's explore some key decisions. I'm just going to have a bit of a look at the policy. So I'm going to share it slightly differently here because I'm going to pop open a Microsoft Word document and give you a quick fire run through of the document. So it's a Microsoft Word document, so it's editable by all of you. For each of your organizations. And you can see here at the top, there's space for people to put their logo, their company name. You can adapt it to be the branding and colors of your organization. It's called the Human Resource Guidebook. And you'll see on the cover page, it kind of says, look, the date it's approved. So guidance would be for something like HR, because when it goes wrong, it's higher risk and you can land in court and it can cost the organization money and it can cost time. That a human resource policy is best to be signed off. If you are in a CLG or you're a charity or anything like that, it's best to be signed off by the board. It's best to be signed off by those people who are kind of legally responsible for all of this stuff. As you're probably aware, the staff are all employees, including the CEO or the manager, if you're in a CLG. If that makes sense. So so the board are technically the employer, so they should be signing off on this policy. They don't have to develop it, they'd need to sign off on it. So you have the date it's approved, the date for review. So usually it's recommended, if you look at most quality standards around policies and procedures, that policies are reviewed every 3 years. But with employment law, it's good to be astute and listening out for any changes, because you don't want it to be 3 years before your policy includes paternity leave, which because it was something that was changed, in the last couple of years. So you want to keep an ear out for any legal changes and make sure that you incorporate them into your policy. I've given you some suggestions as to where you can keep an ear to the ground for any changes in law. The wheel have a HR bulletin as well. Sorry, you can sign up for a HR bulletin from the wheel. So there's a few places we can get those things. So the table of contents. This is the introduction overview. What you see what I mean by the red text. So the red text absolutely has to be changed. But the black text you might read and be like, well, that seems not exactly in the tone or the personality of our organization. So we might rewrite that or change it up a little bit. What you'll see is where, where it's the law, we'll write that it's the law in the policy. So you'll know, well, I can't change that. I can't change the law. But there are some sections that you can change. So sections you could technically change, say, principles, because that's not law. That's really more about how your organization implements it. Roles and responsibilities. So you'll see here, you're going to need to change the name. This is the person who's in charge of the organization below the board. Find the name for them and change it. So this describes roles and responsibilities of CEO, manager, and person in charge, and the board. For those of you, I said highlight with the with you kind of the role of the board. Often with something like this, the board is responsible for ensuring that there are appropriate systems in place that are then operationalized by the staff team. So as a board, you'd want to be confident that there's a good set of policies and procedures and people with the adequate skills to implement them, and that you have a system by which they can report any risks or concerns to you. So that's really what you're looking for as a board when it comes to HR. And that you have a committee that can help if anything goes wrong. If there's grievances or disciplinary, you'll often need to be involved in appeals or different things like that. So it's good to be really aware of the processes around this. There's sections on record keeping. There's a section on equal opportunities, and then eligibility to work. So here we get into induction. So you may have a formal induction process or you may not. We've put in what is good practice in induction, and you'll adapt it as you need to reflect the reality of your organization. Definitely changing the red text, maybe approving or changing the black text. So it discusses an induction process and checklist. There's a section on probation, and important to note that even though people are on probation, they still have the right to kind of fair process. You can't just let someone go for no reason on probation. They still have the right. The idea with probation is that you shouldn't get as far as 12 months unless you're confident that the person's staying, because once they hit 12 months, they are then covered by the Unfair Dismissals Act. So you should make sure you work really hard to make probation really effective in identifying if someone is appropriate for you and you're appropriate to them, and you can work together, So employees have all of the statutory and contractual rights on probation, but you can obviously make it a little bit shorter and neater to ensure that any disciplinary procedures and things like that can be implemented swiftly and effectively during that time. Here's a section on leave. Let's pop this down onto the next page so we can see it together. What you'll see is that there's a summary of kind of leave, and then the rest of the section goes into detail. So this is a high level summary of leave, where we put in the column here what is statutory, and you may extend that. For example, with annual leave, you have a statutory obligation to provide 20 days or whatever that is pro rata for people who are on part-time contracts. You can specify if there's particular dates that must be taken, over Christmas, or particular dates in summer where the service closes. And detail whether you carry days over into the next year if the leave isn't taken. So there's all kinds of leave there, and you can use that as a summary, a quick reference tool for yourselves. This goes further into detailing your obligations. So that's a verbal kind of explanation of all the stuff you would have put in that table. I'm just going to I'll answer that question in a minute. Is that okay? Thanks, Mary, for popping that in. I'll come back to that in a minute. Public holidays, we now have 10. Woohoo! We used to have 9, so that's all there. You'll have to clarify your approach to people's leave if you open on public holidays. It goes through all of it. You're familiar with all these things: jury duty, compassionate leave, force majeure. So it details all of those things. There's things around sick leave. Procedures around sick leave, notification periods, etc. Maternity and paternity, so you can specify what your approach to that is. It's interesting. A really good resource if you want to know what other organizations are up to in relation to, say, maternity leave, places where leave is optional and the law isn't very specific. If you want to know if other organizations are paying people additional for the maternity leave above the statutory, the National Pay and Benefits Survey for the National Pay and Benefits Report for the community, voluntary and charity sector, which was published in 2019 and is due to be published again later this year or early next year, contains a really good summary of kind of the state of the sector in relation to many of these conditions. What we know, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, in 2019, about 50% of organizations were topping up on maternity leave and 50% were not. So that's kind of, and you can see averages of annual leave and people's approaches to that. So worth a review if you're trying to see what the sector norm is. There's a full table here on leave for parents because it's all getting a little bit confusing with parents' leave and parental leave and paternity leave and all those different things. So that's all detailed in a table there. Then we move away from all of this stuff as kind of a lot of it, a lot of the minimums are detailed by law, and then you can add additional on. We're down to performance management, which is less legally detailed, but still relevant to all these other processes. So there's a code of conduct for employees that you can adapt and make your own. It details things around relationships with clients. Then it talks next is about the process of supervision. So again, we've put in good practice, but you're obviously going to have to adapt this to what you need for your organization. There are as many ways of implementing this as there are organizations. So it talks about kind of supervision sessions and how you prepare and how what you do after it. There's a section on appraisal, that usually annual thing I mentioned earlier. There's a section on training and professional development. So a lot of organizations are struggling to have training budgets in place again. So it's just to see what's suitable for you. Some people will provide training to their staff on very specific things that are needed. Other people might give some staff study leave or different things like that to support their personal professional development. So all of that's kind of detailed in there, potential protocols for you. This section here, harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, grievance, and disciplinary. This we would be keeping it as it is. And if you already have policies on this, good to cross-reference them, because this is very dictated by codes of practice, and procedure is essential when it comes to these things, knowing what you're supposed to be doing when, what's supposed to be written down, who it's supposed to be written down to, sent by, who's, all of that's really important when it comes to this stuff, because procedure is what a lot of court cases end up being lost on either side. Okay. So good to really familiarize yourself with that. And really these procedures are protective, like fundamentally they do protect people in your workplace, and they're designed to protect employees from these things. So they are your friend if you want to create a safe and healthy workplace. And there's things around disciplinary processes, grievance processes, with suggested steps and things like that. It goes on to have a section on leaving, as we discussed. This is the statutory minimums for notice that's detailed in law. You can change that to suit your organization as long as it's above, the statutory minimum notice required. There's things around redundancy, so how you choose roles for redundancy, employee entitlements around redundancy and their right to kind of notice periods and redundancy payments and things like that. There's a section on working from home, how very current, and guidance around that. There's, working from home is in twice, which means it must be very good and important. We'll have to delete that. So, and then there's that section on volunteering. So some guidance and good practice around your volunteering. You might choose to pull that out to a separate policy. Just to say that there are other policies that are like, there's policy on recruitment and selection. That's a separate policy and that has lots of templates. I'm not going to go through that with you today, but it's a complementary policy. There's a policy on Garda vetting. So you can look at adapting that to your organization. There's a policy on lone working. So there's lots of stuff there that you may find very useful that is complementary to this policy. So I'm going to stop sharing there and I'm going to pause recording for a second. Okay, let's just check where we are, folks, in terms of getting through our material and what section we're in. So we've just kind of had a quick look through that resource, the HR guidebook, which is available to all organizations. And what we're going to do next is we're going to just have, this is the fun bit. It's all fun. But this piece, we're going to look at some case law. But what we might do, would you guys like to go and grab a quick cup of tea? Because the next bit, there's a little bit more in it. It would probably be worth your while just going and grabbing an energizing cup of tea and move your blood. And we can come back in 10 minutes to move into the second half of the training. Would that suit you guys? Yeah, so I'll see you at like 23 minutes past, it's 10 minutes from now. See you then.
So can I just say before you go, I have to, can you hear me, Aoife?
I can hear you loud and clear. So welcome back. So far, we've kind of mapped the terrain. So where do we get the rules around employment law from? What are the processes that these kind of rules apply to? Everything from induction all the way through to termination of employment, or the ending of employment, whatever form that might take. And we've looked at kind of where all that lies in your guidebook. So what we're going to look at now is just to kind of clarify, I suppose, what are some of the risks in relation to the employment journey? Some of the key risks. We're not going to go through the whole thing. This is just to give you a bit of a flavor of the importance of two things. The first thing is the importance of having robust policies and procedures. And the second thing is the importance of the people who are implementing them. And we're going to talk about both of those things for the next few minutes. Okay, so effective performance management is a combination of what we discussed before. So having robust, well-considered policies that are implemented and records are kept. And, you know, the first question you're asked in any court case is, do you have a policy and procedure? Did you follow them? You know, show me. And then the third is show me the evidence. So that's where our kind of good record keeping, people kind of, you know, well internally trained to implement those policies, everyone on the same page. The other half of it is this little person here, or your senior staff, whoever is in charge of implementing these policies, and kind of the personal qualities and capacity that they have in this regard. So you've mentioned a number of traits that you think are really important for someone to implement this, particularly when things are hitting the fan and it's getting a bit challenging with an employee or between employees. What are you looking at? So we want to implement our good policies fairly and consistently. That's easier said than done. So we've said have good policies that are up to date and relevant to your organization, culture, and team. So taking that policy guide book and just putting your logo on it and your company name isn't going to cut the mustard. If you really want your team to feel ownership, buy-in, and to kind of invest in implementing those policies consistently, then they need to be engaged in reviewing them. You know, it can be a good idea to circulate a policy or a specific section of the policy and say, does this work for you? How does this feel? Or you can have a meeting where you discuss certain sections of the policy. Any way you can foster buy-in, particularly by your management who will be implementing those policies, is obviously a good thing. And making sure everyone knows what's recorded, when, where, and how. But how you use these policies. So have clear values. Many of your organizations probably have values, do you? Like you have a set of values by which you work. It's good to look at and to do an exercise, if you have the opportunity to do a values exercise with your teams, where you explore what your values are for how you work together and what that means in practice. So it's all well and good to say we're respectful, but we're like, well, what does that mean in practice? How might we not be respectful to, or when are we respectful to each other? Let's give examples. Let's discuss what that means. And making sure there's really solid discussions around your various values, because any set of values really should be the minutes of a really good discussion with your team around what your values are. Because in those discussions, you can have, we raise issues before they become too difficult. We are open and we communicate directly. We don't take, feedback, fair feedback on our work personally. There's different things like that where you can agree some of those more contentious things. So you're looking a bit like a values can act as a prevention to some of those issues progressing into something legal and more formal. The other thing having a set of values does for you, both at a personal level as well as at an organizational level, is they can help to guide you when things get tough. So you're sitting there being like, oh my God, should we just fire this person or pay them out or blah, 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 and you go back to your policies and you say, no, we're fair. We are efficient. We make good use of public resources. We're going to work it in this way. And it can be often, it can be kind of a mirror to remind you of who you are and who you want to be when you're in challenging situations in relation to HR and performance management. And it can really help to guide. Biases. That was the first thing that you guys mentioned. When we talk about biases, actually, you know, we'll come back to that one in just a minute, because biases is an interesting one. There's a couple of things to think about in relation to that. Know your own fears and weaknesses. If you're a bit scared, and like this is, I don't mean fear like, you know, serious fear. I mean, what are the things that make you wobble and make you feel a bit like, oh, and that you worry that you might be very good at? It's very good to if you're not great in conflict, be aware of that. So rather than walking into a meeting with a staff member with wobbly knees, just knowing you don't like conflict, it means you go, right, I'm going to have a prep session with my colleague. We're going to act it. We're going to, you know, strategize it out. We could say it could go this way, it could go that way. What am I going to say if she says this? How am I going to deal with that? So that you're building up your own confidence and doing sufficient preparation for the things that you feel you're not so good at. It might help you to be honest about what training you need, little things like that. So do know your fears and know your weaknesses. Or if you might be someone who, you know, hangs down too hard on the rules when you get a bit unsure of yourself. So how can you kind of show flexibility and prepare for that and talk to your colleagues about how you can avoid being too, you know, to that side of things. Know your relationships. So know if there's, you know, oh,
Hi, Mike.
Just mute Martina there. So just know your relationships. What do we mean by that is don't be over familiar, don't be cold and distant. Like just remember who you're dealing with, what your relationships are in work, and work in the context of that. It can be useful, you know, if you haven't had a good time with someone or you've had difficulty before, to name that and say, look, I know maybe we haven't gotten on so well in the past, but I'm really eager for us to resolve this. I'm really eager to support you in this. And hopefully we'll get to build our relationship a bit more through this process, whatever, you know, works for you and feels true and authentic. But just to acknowledge if you don't know someone very well, or if you haven't gotten on well in the past or anything like that, to know that for yourself. Recognize that engagement can take time. So if you are, say, working through kind of performance management issues, that you're working hard to kind of build up the relationship and build up the trust through the process, and affording enough time to everything to do that, not rushing people through it. You have to be willing to challenge staff. So you have to be willing. I mean, really HR and performance management, when you're in a managerial position, it's challenging because fundamentally what you're trying to do in any moment in time is ensure you're balancing the needs and well-being of staff and your resources with the needs of the organization, you know, the business needs, the needs of service users. So staff saying, well, we want a longer lunch break. And you saying, well, we can't because we have to, you know, you're always, do you know what I mean? It's always this kind of balancing act. And they're all obviously interrelated and they all depend on each other, but you are balancing and you have to be willing to challenge staff, no matter how good and well and excellently things are going. There has to be points where you have to say, well, that's not quite in line with our standard, or we don't tend to work in that way, and not being afraid of that. And if you're a conflict avoider, that line will speak to you, I think. But on the other side of the house, if you have policies that are in place a long time, or that might not, if your business has changed, there might be things that are no longer relevant. So while you stand over your policies and procedures, they shouldn't be like ironclad either. You know, if staff have good suggestions, the way things can change, or it's okay to consider that and say, well, does this need to change? She's made a really good point. Maybe, you know, often it's there for a reason, and it might not change, but it's good to be willing and to think in some exceptional circumstances that the processes or policies might need to change. With flexibility, it's another one of these kind of show some, but not too much. And, you know, with flexibility, it's important within HR and performance management processes that you can show us flexibility. So if you're kind of saying, look, Mary, we asked you to get all, poor El Mary, I've used her name twice this evening. Let's go, let's say Joanne. So we say, look, Joanne, we asked you to get all of the client files up into the new CRM system by the end of, or we want you to get them all up by the end of June. So you have 3 weeks to do that. Can you get them all up? And she says, well, actually, no, I can't get them all up. There's not a chance I can get them all up by then. Can I do it then? So you go, yeah, sure. And you're being flexible and you're showing you're willing to be flexible. But then you have to know the limits to flexibility. Because if you have 10 people who all need to get those files up and you have a deadline, and then you have to be consistent and you have to show the same flexibility to everyone. So be careful of the precedents you set if you are showing any flexibility in that regard. So yeah, understand the importance of precedence and fairness. So if someone says, if there's a bit of a, can I get away with it this time, or, you know, will we let this thing slide? Just be wary of what precedent you're setting, because presume that if you allow something to happen with one staff member and say, yeah, you can take a few extra days for your son's communion and because you're going on holiday, yeah, you can take an extra day. Just be aware that, to be fair, that needs to be available to everyone else in the organization then. So be really careful about precedence and fairness. And then the other thing, in any process, it's just good to do it anyway. I don't need to say that to you, but communicating consistently about anything related to performance in HR, not in a way that's nagging, but communicating consistently is and clearly can be very helpful to people to help them navigate any difficulties you're experiencing. The one in relation to bias. Would most of you agree that we all have some kind of biases? That everyone does have a bias of some sort? I mean, science and evidence would say absolutely we all have biases. Why? Because they're a natural function of our human brains. Bias is essentially comes from the innate ability to judge a situation really quickly and decide if it's safe or unsafe. So I'm standing here and or if I'm driving my car and something comes out in front of my car and I bang on the brakes, but it turned out to be a pile of leaves, right? So I made the decision, snap, this is a safe or unsafe situation. My brain decided it was unsafe and I reacted to it, even though it turned out to be safe. So my brain can't know necessarily, but it has to make these snap judgments based on minimal information. It does the same with people. So we judge people as safe or unsafe, real snap. If you had to guess, who are we more likely to judge as unsafe? I don't mean unsafe like they're going to beat us up. I mean, like our brain just gets maybe a little activated or nervous around certain groups of people. Who are they most likely to be? People who aren't like us. In what way? Well, the evidence would suggest that there are certain traits that we kind of create what we know as what we call in-groups and out-groups. Can you guess what they are? Age, gender, race, social class, professional, you know, so we'll tend to have these in-groups and out-groups, and our nervous system naturally will often categorize people from out-groups as little, you know, we're not feeling 100% okay around them, which is why sometimes if you haven't been around a member of a particular group or community, you might feel yourself a little kind of nervous or kind of over anxious to be okay around them, and you know, that kind of feeling. So that's kind of just your body being like, oh, I don't know how to handle this situation. I know how to handle people who are like me, but I don't know how to handle people who aren't like me, and I don't know what to do here. And that can give us a bit of nervous energy. When we're nervous, we're not always thinking as clearly as we could be. It's much harder to be fair and consistent when we're a little nervous or activated around certain groups. So it's really saying that if you want to be a fair, consistent manager and you want to be an equal opportunities employer, a really nice gift to yourself and to those around you is to kind of do a little bit of work on kind of calming yourself, understanding your biases and things like that. Because if your biases make you behave in a way that's kind of nervous, learning how to calm yourself and ground yourself can be really helpful in that regard. The other thing to know is with biases, no worries, Martina, thanks for that. The other thing to know with biases is biases aren't just about kind of the 9 ground stuff, you know, age, gender, different things like that. We also have things called they're like cognitive biases that, you know, we can have biases against kind of people. They're like the cognitive biases that are kind of that influence how we perceive other people, not on those grounds, but on previous experiences that have happened. So there's things like this thing called like a self-serving bias, right? And self-serving biases, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say this, which is like, it means we're likely to attribute the causes of negative outcomes to other people or to the environment and positive outcomes to ourselves. Do you know what I mean by that? So if we win a football match, we're more likely to say, yay, it was because I did a really good job. And if you lose the football match, you're going to say the goalie was all over the place and my other team member sucked. And we have a kind of natural propensity to do that. In work, what that means is if Billy falls and hurts himself on the stairs, we're most likely to say Billy's very, very careless. And he never puts the sign up, or Mary, or no, Mary, not doing Mary again, poor Mary's to blame for everything this evening. So Billy falls on the stairs, it's probably Billy's fault, and it's probably Jer's fault because he never puts the sign up after an accident. So it's Billy and Jer's fault. Whereas Billy is more likely to say, well, it's the organization's fault because I fell. Does that make sense? So what does that mean for you if you're managing someone? Be careful, because you might be more likely to blame them than look at yourself, the organization, policies, procedures, different things like that. It can impact on your sense of fairness. The other thing to be aware of is, whether we like it or not, we sometimes like some people more than others. And for some reason, maybe we had a falling out with them in the past, or who knows what else. There are some people who we don't necessarily get on with that well or like that well. And the research tells us there's a thing called like reactive devaluation. Reactive devaluation is that we devalue the opinion or experience of someone that we mightn't align ourselves with very well, or someone we mightn't get on with. So an example of an experiment they did where they got kind of someone to look at they got two groups of American Republicans. So Republicans are the people who kind of support Donald Trump and all of what we considered the kind of more conservative side of things. And then the Democrats are considered kind of, more lefty and progressive side of things. And they gave copies of a foreign policy to two groups of Republicans. In one of them, they said it was written by John McCain, who was a Republican presidential candidate. And the other one, they said, was written by Barack Obama, and gave them to each group. Exact same foreign policy brief. And of course, the group who got John McCain's like, this is amazing, this is great. And the group who got Barack Obama is like, this is terrible, even though they're both from the same party. So that's reactive devaluation, is like, who it's from. So you're going to shoot the messenger, kind of. Does that make sense? So what does that mean for you if you are managing people? Is that you have to be careful that your biases of your past experiences with that person don't impact on your ability to be fair if there is a performance management issue, or you're supporting an issue between kind of employees. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions on that bit so far? All good? Excellent. So there's one other thing I'm going to kind of share with you, one more concept. And concept of psychological safety. This is kind of speaking a little bit to what Diane was saying in one group, talking about the idea of kind of calmness and things like that. If you have an what we mean by psychological safety is that it's safe for me to make mistakes, to not be perfect, to learn, to grow, to improve. So you can't expect people to learn, to grow, and improve if you don't expect people to make mistakes, fail, and all that. Is that reasonable? Like, that's kind of the two sides of the same coin, is learning, growth, development. The other side of that coin is mess ups and failure and all of that kind of stuff. If you don't allow for both of those things, then you're going to have an organization where people are more likely to be trying to cover their tracks, blame other people, that you'll create a culture where people are not going to take responsibility, and where people are going to be much harder to manage. So the idea is that if you really want to avoid the worst of all of this stuff, is that you create an organization where people feel psychologically safe. The other benefit, apart from kind of just, ethical benefit of doing it, the, effectiveness of doing it for HR. The third thing is, though, if you have an organization where people aren't afraid to take risks and make mistakes, you're going to have more innovation. You're going to have more amazing ideas. You're going to have a much happier staff team who get to try different things and bring kind of their great ideas to you. So the green one is like, people are happy to make mistakes, learn from their failure, share ideas, then you've better innovation and decision making. Whereas when you have psychologically dangerous, that sounds a bit dramatic, but when people aren't feeling safe to be less than perfect and mess up and get help, then you have a fear of admitting mistakes. People will blame other people, and they're less likely to share different views. And there's a thing called the common knowledge effect, which is people do the kind of basic minimum to get through. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. We're going to move into kind of a wind up and a close for now, folks. I'm just going to check the chat really quickly to